Well, this was bound to happen one of these days. You guys know how interested I am in games with multiple ports on multiple platforms, and in that realm, there's one title that reigns unchallenged in the sheer number of times it's been adapted to new hardware. A game that walked so Skyrim could run. Without a doubt, Resident Evil 4 has found its way into more pieces of gaming hardware than Silicon itself, so I hope you've got some snacks on hand because we've got a lot of material to cover. Oh, and just to avoid the inevitable comments about newer renditions of early RE4 builds in engines like Unreal, those are really cool, but I feel like they might be a bit outside the scope of a video like this. I don't know, I'm a stickler with these kind of things. I want to have those original assets present being pumped out of original console video output. Well, everyone, strap in because from here on out it's going to be a near constant info dump, which, if you're subscribed to this channel, is likely what you're looking for anyways. What's up, guys? I'm Jared from Avalanche Reviews. Welcome back to the Resident Evil Retrospective.
¿Qué carajo estás haciendo aquí? ¡Lárgate, cabrón!
If we're going to cover Resident Evil 4, it's probably a good time to address a common misconception, one that admittedly I contribute to more than my fair share. Despite me using almost every opportunity imaginable to dunk on this game and my very public criticisms of it, I genuinely enjoy the shit out of RE4. If you get the sense there's some animosity in my voice when talking about it, you're not wrong, but it's not directed towards the game itself. I mean, we were all there in the early 2000s. RE4 was a real event in gaming, a wave of hype that mostly rang true. I got my copy early from a friend who worked at GameStop and wasn't too afraid of being fired, and even though there was a rager going on at my house thanks to a few touring bands in the area staying over, me and my wife stayed up all night locked in my room playing it. Believe me, it was awesome. Now that's not to say it's without its flaws. I honestly feel like RE4 is an incredible case study at how truly bad a game's pacing can be, along with a few other things, but that absolutely does not keep it from being fun as all hell. Hell, most of my issues don't even lie with the game itself, but more have to do with the cult of personality surrounding it. I'd wager 4 was a good majority of the modern RE fanbase's first experience with the franchise, and that's not to say that RE4 fans are a bunch of Johnny-come-latelys. It was just a right time, right place sort of scenario. In 2005, the PS2 was one of the best-selling pieces of tech in existence, getting the medium in front of more new eyes than it had ever seen, and more new players than ever were finding themselves getting wrapped up in the industry for the first time. Parents' new video game consoles were the hot new item for birthdays and Christmases again, and overall it seemed like a majority of the planet was finally catching on to what we old guys have been talking about for years. Capcom just happened to release an entry in what was a relatively niche series comparatively speaking, and the fact that it was so radically different and the absolute fortune the Big C spent on advertising meant nearly every middle schooler on Earth had its name in their mouth. This obviously led to amazing sales, which is a good thing for the industry overall, but it also meant every subsequent RE game to be released for nearly 2 decades would play exactly like 4. And if you just so happen to find yourself more interested in the older survival horror style entries in the series during this time, well, I guess you could go fuck yourself. So when I inevitably talk an entire septic tank worth of shit about this game, and trust me, I will, just keep in mind the problem isn't with 4 as a game, but with what it did to a franchise I loved up to that point. To be fair, most of you watching this video probably prefer that over-the-shoulder, more action-oriented linear style, and that's totally cool. You guys won this fight, and it's pretty clear why. Old folks like me just don't make up a majority of the market anymore, and while I wish that wasn't the case, well, it is what it is. So please allow me this one outlet to get some stuff off my chest while keeping in mind I have put easily more than 200 hours into this game. It is an absolute gem and became a damn revolution in game design trends. I respect what it is and what it did for the industry. I just don't like what it did to Resident Evil. And with that novel of a preamble out of the way, let's get into the good stuff.
I was starting to wonder when you might notice us.
And unsurprisingly, we're going to have to start with the OG Resident Evil 4 experience to kick off this port bonanza. The only issue being, well, which OG experience are we talking? This game went through an insane number of internal revisions before actually hitting shelves, and we're not talking a few character redesigns. These were full-on brand new games with totally different stories. So I guess to put it in context, take the whole Resident Evil 1.5 debacle and multiply it by like 3. Before taking its final form, there was the Fog or Castle and Hookman or Hallucination versions of RE4. The first one I was ever aware of was the Fog build, and that's because when RE1 Remake was being developed, I used to visit Capcom's website on a daily basis just to watch a horribly compressed embedded QuickTime trailer of it, and eventually the teaser for RE4 showed up on that same site. This being around the same time Hideki Kamiya was convinced to take his in-the-works RE project and title it Devil May Cry. The original story for RE4 in this build was actually pretty close to the source material, kind of, with Leon taking part in a Special Forces-led raid on Oswald Spencer's estate, but before they could get down to business, the team was attacked by a black fog, which turned out to be a BOW that would leave Leon alive but infected. The goal was to have players deal with a Leon who had to somehow keep himself from succumbing to the illness while getting to the bottom of the progenitor virus. So yeah, it's a little different, but all the main points are still there pretty much. Leon still makes a run on a weird remote castle, gets infected, and then finds out the origins of the T-virus, so kinda similar when you think about it. After this came the Hookman or Hallucination build, which was essentially the same game but reworked a bit. Leon still found himself infected by some virus, but this time around players would have to deal with the hallucinations Leon was afflicted with as a result of his infection. Watching the teaser and following information that was slowly leaking out, most of us got the idea that what was on display here was some form of what we could conceivably expect in a final release, but thanks to new interviews, it seems like the titular Hookman might have been more of a method for showing off graphical effects and scenarios than an actual planned antagonist. So for those of you disappointed we never got that Hookman build, keep in mind in some kind of weird alternate universe where that version of the game did release, it still wouldn't give us what we saw in the teaser. So as you can see, Capcom took their usual approach to developing this game, and that is to say an incredibly convoluted one. But you guys didn't come here to talk about what could have been, did you? Let's get down to the real star of the show. Resident Evil 4 hit US Gamecubes at the start of 2005, and there is no doubt that it shaped the course of video game history. At this point, the third-person perspective was a well-worn mechanic in popular game design, but 4 took the camera and locked it close to the character's back while angling it just a little bit above their shoulder, which led to a really cool look and maybe a claustrophobically tight FOV. And yeah, maybe that perspective is great for doing a little exploring and looking around, but in a shooting game, you definitely don't want your character taking up more than a third of the screen real estate. Which is exactly why hitting the R1 button to ready your weapon will zoom the camera in over Leon's shoulder, making sure that the only thing in sight is your enemies, your gun model, and Leon's head. And sticking on the same subject, the guys behind 4 could have certainly gone the tried and true constant on-screen reticle route here, and I doubt many of us would have complained, but instead we get this stylish as hell laser sight that allowed for the same functionality but integrated itself into the actual game world. A move that someone like me who values immersive visuals over actual functionality was ecstatic to see. In fact, it may very well have been RE4 that first showed me how a developer can take a video gamey concept like an on-screen reticle and make it blend into the world the game's trying to convince me I'm in. And I'm happy to say we are nowhere near the end of RE4's list of innovations and great design ideas. And continuing in that theme, on-screen button prompts had definitely been a thing since the earliest days of gaming, but I would argue few titles used them like this. And speaking of QTEs, I can definitely say these things effectively accomplish their goal, that of course being a rocketing heart rate in any player experiencing them. Having that prompt plastered across your screen demanding you smash your controller as fast as humanly possible, all while your on-screen avatar rushes out of the way of a gigantic Mecha Napoleon, is enough to raise even the calmest person's pulse. The only issue being that whole plastered across the screen thing. Like I mentioned before, I'd rather have an unobstructed view of the game world as it gives me a stronger sense of immersion. Basically, the fewer things on screen that reminds me I'm playing a video game, the better. Well, as you would imagine, these bright green and red buttons flashing across my screen take what can be a fairly atmospheric horror game and turns it into a casual run of Dragon's Lair, which is the absolute worst part of all this. See, I love QuickTime events. In theory. Sure, you could argue that it's a little annoying when one happens during a cutscene, as the typical move when a game starts a scene like this is to put your controller down, take a drink and relax, and having to watch the same event a few times till you get a QTE right is not my idea of a really good time.
Hasta luego.
But they do their job really well. Anytime one of these things show up, I start sweating immediately, and I almost automatically shut out anything that isn't the game in front of me. I just wish there were a way of performing the same function while still having the resulting image feel like it's a part of the game world. I would love a version of QuickTime events that didn't have big bright button prompts flashing on my screen the whole time. If we're being honest though, I doubt very much there's a way to actually get this done. But it would be nice to have some kind of theoretical perfect world where I can participate in QTEs while not sacrificing the immersive elements I find so important. Another radical change to games as a whole would be RE4's approach to difficulty scaling. See, most games have your standard easy, normal, and hard difficulties, but Mikami wanted something a little more subtly tweakable. As you play RE4, the game is constantly changing HP values, damage output, enemy AI, and even the number of on-screen foes based on how well or poorly you've been playing. So if you were having a rough time with an encounter and died a few times only to defeat them with ease on the third try, sorry to burst your bubble, but you didn't level up your reaction time quite as much as you might have thought. Now, I know that sounds like a great concept, but for me, this is more of a good idea on paper than it is a functional mechanic in practice. Sure, if you're doing poorly, this can really help you see the end credits, which is always valuable in an action game. But if you find yourself doing really well at the game, you never quite get to an equilibrium where you can flex how well you've learned its little quirks. Meaning you don't get to just steamroll an encounter after spending hours and hours getting good at RE4. But the game not letting you kick its ass once you're good enough isn't the only issue. See, once the challenge increases, the chance for cheap bullshit grows exponentially. Of course, the obvious argument here would be that the game would be boring if you could just effortlessly breeze through each area, and I would definitely agree, but there's something about the way this game plays that makes the hits you take feel less like mistakes on your end, but instead the result of the limitations you're up against. Leon's on-screen movement is incredibly stiff at the best of times, and the amount of sensitivity lost while aiming your weapon is jarring. On top of this, the camera is very zoomed in on Leon's back, so peripheral view is almost non-existent. On the plus side, there is a great use of directional audio cues that'll let you know when something's behind you and getting ready to attack. But to counter that, most of the time, even when you know it's coming, quick turning, backing up, and aiming your weapon takes so much time that you're just going to have to eat the hit regardless. And as you can imagine, increasing the amount of enemies you'll encounter and making them act more intelligently leads to way more of these moments, which are not very fun in my opinion. Continuing on that same point, when I'm failing at a boss encounter and need to retry a few times, I like the feeling of overcoming that challenge as a result of learning their moves and behavior. You know, the whole Mega Man effect. Well, in RE4, after a few deaths, you'll notice the boss just goes down without much effort after you failed a few times, and that does feel a little cheap to me. Of course, that's just a generalization. Hell, I'm not even sure the dynamic difficulty even applies to boss encounters, but you get my drift. Now, I'm not trying to reopen the age-old argument of accessibility versus satisfying difficulty, but it seems to me someone who isn't very good at the game would be better suited just choosing a lower difficulty and playing the entire game that way. If you're even okay at RE4 and you want to start a new game right now, it won't be long till you're essentially playing at the hardest difficulty it can offer, and that's totally okay. I just wish it was consistently that difficult. When I can tell it's actively helping me, I feel like I'm being patronized, and when it's actively working against me, it gets so damn cheap that the experience loses a lot of the fun factor that makes the game so satisfying in the first place. Of course, this topic is going to be very subjective. Your experience may be totally different from mine, and that's fine. But as far as I'm concerned, this adaptive difficulty idea is cool, but might have needed a little more time and testing before implementation. Oh, and I'm nearly positive that someone in the comments has already used that old chestnut, well, this guy doesn't seem to be having a problem, while linking to footage of some expert RE4 speedrunner. And I guess if that's our metric for what is and is not difficult, I assume most of you would have no issues whatsoever perfectly countering every hit of Chun's super lightning legs while neutral jumping to kick to low forward, buffering Shoryu, and canceling into Shippujin Raikyaku. I mean, after all, someone on the internet did it, so... Of course, in this port comparison video, we're not exactly here to review this game from a gameplay perspective, but more than anything, I wanted to talk about the ways in which it innovated. I may personally think that a lot of the games that came out after 4 were able to better expand on and implement these concepts, but there's no doubt the video games we play today would be radically different without these first baby steps in this direction. You guys know what I'm all about, though. What I really want to get into is the absolute marvel that is Resident Evil 4's presentation.
Need a ride, handsome?
Okay.
There's no denying RE4 made Nintendo's little Gamecube work harder than it ever had before, and while there are some complaints to be found in this area, just know that a lot of the reverence I have for this game comes from what it was able to accomplish both for the hardware it first appeared on and the time it was released. This is an amazing looking game that used effects I hadn't really seen on the Gamecube before and sometimes after. For example, these half transparencies are all over the game and they have this amazing lifelike look to them. You'll even see this effect applied to the on-screen blood, which really leaves an impact when blood from your enemies sprays on adjacent walls. The fog used in RE4 is also really damn impressive. While it's not volumetric, it might be easy to think it is with how organically these things seem to behave. Another nice little quirk comes from the way the GameCube outputs video. Anyone who's ever seen the Cube's high-quality RGB video output on a high-resolution display will be familiar with the little vertical lines that can be found in complex colors and gradients. The only issue being, I don't exactly know why it's there. I think it may be some kind of unique approach to dithering, but there's more traditional dithering to be found elsewhere in the GameCube, so honestly, who knows? To be honest, I've never really seen this phenomena explained properly, and if you know something I don't, please feel free to educate me in the comments section. I'd love to finally understand why this shows up in some games. Since RE4 uses a lot of fog effects layered over darker environments, you're likely to see these vertical lines a lot during normal play if you're upscaling on a modern TV. And while some seem to not like the look of dithering or naturally appearing artifacts like this, I've always sort of loved them. There's just something about seeing each console's unique and novel approach to video output, and little flaws like this are almost like a piece of hardware's calling card, or more accurately, its visual fingerprint. Of course, it should go without saying this will likely be a non-issue when being viewed on the CRT displays this game was made to be played on. These low-resolution, softer TVs are going to mask a lot of this stuff behind its phosphorescent glow and scan lines, so keep that in mind when trying to figure out if you want to dive into the realm of higher quality retro video. While there are very obvious upsides to throwing a RetroTink 5X or OSSC into your setup, for better or worse, you're going to be able to see a lot more than you're used to. Staying on actual track, Resident Evil 4 is the only RE game ever released on the GameCube that allows for an officially supported progressive scan mode. That's right, no forcing 480p through software here. And while 480p is always a welcome display mode, I'm sure a lot of you by now are noticing just how aliased and pixelated this picture is on top of its aspect ratio. And the reason things look like they've been zoomed in a shit ton is because, well, they have been. RE4 was made to be viewed in a faux letterboxed mode, so if you wanted to boot up a game of RE4 right now on a real GameCube, this is what you'd be looking at. A 4:3 image with letterboxing on the top and bottom that allows it to be stretched to a 16:9 aspect ratio. Now, I've heard this was done because Mikami thought it gave the game a more cinematic look, but more realistically, I imagine this was how they were able to get the game looking so damn good. I mean, think about it. You'd be surprised how many pixels you can include in your assets when you're only using half of the console's vertical resolution. The exact number seems to vary, but based on what I've seen online, the actual rendered image on screen only takes up a measly 288 vertical lines of resolution, and that's kind of crazy to think about. I imagine this really cut down on processing overhead since the console was outputting most of the image as a black, motionless bar. And if you were one of the very few people who owned a 16:9 display at the time and were able to stretch the image close enough to touching the top and bottom of that display, it looked pretty damn cool. The only problem is, you, me, and nearly everyone else was stuck looking at half a game on their 4:3 CRTs. And keep in mind, this is not an exaggeration, editing trick, or some result of upscaling. This is the exact image you would get playing RE4 on your TV at home right now. And I'm sure there's an argument for future-proofing a game presentation-wise, but when next to no one owns the tech it would take to view a game optimally, I think making forced widescreen the only available viewing option is sort of a dick move. Okay, getting back on track, let's stretch this image back to something the human eye can actually see. Resident Evil 4 is locked to a static 30 frame per second frame rate, and I'll add it keeps that up pretty solidly. There are going to be a few dips here or there, but it's nothing that'll affect gameplay. I was only able to get noticeable slowdown in scenes with a lot of overlapping visual effects or really far draw distances, but it never seemed to get in the way, so see this as more of an interesting tidbit and not some kind of a downside. Okay, so I think we developed a little bit of a baseline so everyone knows the foundation where we're starting from. RE4, warts and all, is one damn impressive package. Not only did it revolutionize how games would orient their cameras and tune their mechanics for decades to come, but it offered an incredibly impressive, if not slightly puzzling visual presentation. It was a really good-looking game that sold really well, so it was only a matter of time before we saw it end up on some other piece of hardware. As some of you may know, around the time of RE4's release, Capcom was locked into a sort of gentleman's exclusivity agreement with Nintendo, and on top of that, Mikami himself threatened to cut off his own head if his game ever saw the inside of a PS2. And I'm not saying I'd like to see him actually follow through with that threat, but I mean, we did get that PS2 port. Just saying. After putting in some real time with it, I would argue RE4 on the PS2 is a far better option than a lot of us give it credit for, although to be fair, that's not exactly our fault. One of my chief issues with the PS2 port back when I made my video covering RE4 for the Resident Evil Retrospective was the fact that it was locked to an interlaced 480i picture. Sadly, a majority of games on the PS2 share this same fate, and if there's one constant in the world, it's that 480p will always look better than 480i. So imagine my surprise when I found out recently there's actually a way to play RE4 on the PS2 in 480p. No workarounds or homebrew software needed. Well, you might be wondering how the hell I missed that, but in my defense, Capcom went about implementing it in the dumbest way imaginable. As some of you might know, a very select amount of PS2 titles actually supported progressive scan, but instead of including it in some kind of toggle in an option menu somewhere, requires you to boot the game holding a specific button combo. The only other game I'm aware of off the top of my head with a similar approach would be Star Ocean Till the End of Time, but there are a few more. Well, either way, put RE4 in your PS2, launch the game and hold down X and triangle. Say yes to progressive scan mode and voila, a beautiful 480p image is now yours. Thanks to the addition of progressive scan, I can say that RE4 on Sony's PS2 is much better looking than I originally gave it credit for. It does seem to be lacking some of the semi-transparent fog effects from the original and possibly some diminished lighting, but those effects are still present in the game and look okay. So yes, it absolutely looks much better than I originally thought, but the Gamecube original still has it beat in terms of sharpness and clarity. I'm not really sure why, but even when both are set to 480p, the PS2 port just has a much less defined, almost muddy picture. Realistically, I don't think this would be something a casual fan of the game would even really notice, but it is interesting to look at. The PS2 was technically the least powerful console of its day in terms of sheer tech specs, but some of you may already know it had very clear advantages over its competitors when it came to architecture and bandwidth. It just required a developer who excelled at the very specific methods needed to take advantage of those upsides. Sadly, ports often got a raw deal on PS2 since they were trying to implement a more standard game in development and coding terms into a console that often needed a highly unique, specialized approach. That means a lot of the PS2's strengths get thrown out the window from the word go, because porting means trying to fit an already complete game into a system that would have required the game to be designed on that platform in the first place. So yes, you will be looking at a less defined, less colorful image the whole time, but unless you're going straight from one to the other, I doubt for most it'll even register on their radars. What very well might though is the fact that there seems to be a slight blur to all on-screen motion here. Or at least there seems to be under certain circumstances. It seems like dark scenes with a lot of overlapping visual effects bring it on mostly, which is the exact scenario that caused the very small bit of slowdown I saw in the Gamecube original. So for all I know, this may be some kind of dynamic thing that saves on processing power, or maybe just another result of the devs trying to find PS2-friendly approximations for Gamecube-specific video effects. Now, you could certainly call the softer picture and flaws like blurring reasons to rank this game below its original release, and while you wouldn't necessarily be wrong, I don't think they're deal breakers. I mean, it would be one thing if they significantly degraded the picture compared to the Gamecube original, but I would say we're in the territory of acceptable loss here. What does seem to be an objective fail though is the audio. Every sound effect, voice recording, and song heard in the PS2 port is going to sound highly compressed and actually sort of muddy to anyone with discerning ears. Here, let's listen to a sample scene that'll show you what I'm talking about. Try to pay attention to the sound of the water flowing in the background and the sound effects for gunshots, reloading, and crows cawing. Now let's look at the same scene but on the PS2. It's almost crazy how much more muddled things sound here, which is very odd. I mean, the Gamecube's small optical disc only allowed for about 1.5 GB of storage space, and the PS2's DVDs could store up to 4. Why would they feel the need to further compress the audio files used in this port? If anything, they should have been able to store more high-quality assets on a DVD with its expanded storage. Now, I will admit up front, I'm no genius when it comes to how files are arranged on a game disc, and maybe I'm missing something here, but there doesn't seem to be any reason for further compressing a file when transferring it to a medium with even more storage. If you know what's going on here, feel free to clue me in, because I'm genuinely stumped by this one. In that same vein, some of the cutscenes on PS2 were just pre-rendered video files instead of being real-time, and once again, I don't really get why this concession was made. On the plus side, the PS2's more blurry video output in this game, displayed on a CRT, would make some of those pre-renders look nearly real-time anyways, so I guess that's a plus. Outside of the audio and visual realms, you're able to use the D-pad in this version, which actually felt pretty good. Now, to be totally honest, I never actually tried to use the D-pad in the GameCube original, so I couldn't tell you whether or not this was a new addition, but let's be real, even if it is usable in-game, no one's ever going to take advantage of it. Moving oddly felt way better to control with the D-pad on the PS2 version, which does sort of make sense now that I think about it. After all, RE4 is basically using tank controls, but with the perspective locked to the character instead of the environment. Capcom, definitely wanting to sweeten the pot for potential buyers, decided to include an unlockable mode in this port, which will let you take control of Ada as she takes care of all of her spy stuff. To be totally honest, I never really felt like this additional content was a deal breaker myself, but I will admit Separate Ways offers a lot of cool gameplay at what feels like a hardened difficulty. Plus the story takes place at the same time right on top of Leon's, which I always thought was cool. All in, I can say this first port of Resident Evil 4 provides a pretty good value. Yes, the trained eye will definitely notice a softer, less visually appealing image than what you'll find in the original, and the sound effects are noticeably worse. At the same time though, you not only get to play the game with what I would consider to be a much better controller, but also the added bonus of Ada's Separate Ways campaign. I feel like that's reason enough to grab this port, or at least it used to be. Now that every port of this game includes this extra content, it is much less of a bargaining chip. Yes, there are definitely better options available to us now, but I feel like RE4 on the PS2 is still at least worth a consideration. Maybe I'm partial to the platform, or I just like seeing the differences that come from the PS2's video output, but either way, I'd give this port a very tentative thumbs up. It probably shouldn't be your first choice when trying to play a game of RE4 on a more retro console, but if you're in a situation where it's the only choice, you won't have to worry about experiencing something radically different from the original. Something you most certainly can't say about the next port on the list.
That's right. She's the daughter of the president. So try to behave yourself, okay?
It's pretty easy to forget that we've only recently been blessed with console to PC ports that are actually worth a damn. Sure, every once in a while you'll get some absolute trash nowadays, but for the most part, developers have locked the process down to a fairly reliable degree. In 2004, however, that was very much not the case. Resident Evil 4's first crack at the PC Master Race was an unmitigated disaster to the point where you could likely count more issues than actual gameplay features. I'm not really sure if it's the porting process that has become easier over time, or if it's console hardware slowly turning away from PowerPC architecture and becoming home computers in horrible-looking cases, but either way, I can assure you this process had not been figured out when this puppy dropped. Booting up RE4 on the PC back in the early 2000s could be deceptively impressive though. Compared to the only two versions available at the time, this was one hell of a sharp, clear picture. Of course, there were a near infinite amount of issues that came with that clarity, but if you haven't played RE4 in a while, and maybe were legally blind, I think it would have been easy to assume this was an upgrade. If you had played it recently though, you might have noticed that there are next to no shadows, barely any fog, or really any shading at all, and trust me when I say RE4 is a game that needs shadows to look good. Oddly enough, this final build of the PC port looks like one of those in-progress videos developers put out when a game isn't finished and some assets haven't been implemented yet. Some scenes are absolutely ruined by this lack of contrast, like the first time you step into the graveyard in front of the church. Speaking of that graveyard, you'll probably also notice that there's almost no fog in this version of the game, and just copy and paste my previous comments here. On the plus side, this game can reach 1080p in a roundabout way. You still have to deal with the stupid letterboxing, and it's a 16:10 aspect ratio, so it's more like 1920 by 1200, but I guess higher res is higher res. Of course, all the clarity in the world doesn't mean anything if you can barely play it, and well, I assume you know where this is going. In a truly insane twist for a PC port, mouse controls in this game weren't even included in the official release, having to be patched in with fan-made trainers. And those modern USB controllers we love so much won't work outside of those same fan-made patches. Which I guess you could forgive them for, since they are modern controllers and this is a game that was released in 2007, but what's a little less forgivable is the fact that the Xbox 360's USB pad was also not supported, which was a controller that was readily available at the time and probably one of the most popular controllers on the market. Luckily, I was able to get my hands on one of the previously mentioned fan-made patches, so I was able to play this with some sort of comfort, but that comfort came with unfamiliar button cues. Something that wouldn't be much of an issue in other games, but when you're being asked to press a very specific button in a very brief window, things get a little more complicated. And yes, you probably could get used to this and even play it like normal after a while, but you will likely be rewatching a lot of cutscenes due to failed QTEs before you get to that point. Continuing on the subject of playability, RE4 on the PC had its frame rate locked to 30 FPS. Of course, that is the same frame rate that you'll get on console, but it feels incredibly choppy and slow here on PC. That's not exactly a strike against the game, because you could probably argue for accuracy at that point, but it does feel like they could have done better. Speaking of which, while doing research, I found out that this was not only a SourceNext product, but it was based on the PS2 version of RE4 for some unknowably dumb reason. For those of you hip to Capcom's other RE-PC ports, the name SourceNext might conjure up images of sharp graphics and uncompressed CG cutscenes, all features you absolutely will not be finding here. In fact, since the base of this port was the PS2 version, you'll find all of the in-engine cutscenes from the original have been replaced with pre-renders from that same release. Something that looked really bad at 480p but looks way worse when you up that operating resolution. And hopefully the conclusion here won't surprise anyone. This version of RE4 is far better left forgotten, and only the most obsessive port junkies should even install it. And while maybe you could argue a few fan patches and fixes might bring it close to parity with the original, a lack of lighting and fog effects leave the picture looking incredibly plain and washed out. On top of that, once you do get your modern USB controller working, you'll need to adapt to a numeric button labeling scheme, so QTEs will be a pain for a very long time. Thankfully, you'd have to go out of your way to get your hands on this port, since it's not available on any of the bigger platforms like Steam, so I wouldn't worry about accidentally coming across it. But that being said, it is a cool look into the past and how these things used to be handled. As luck would have it though, we wouldn't have to wait too long for a proper port to new hardware, the only caveat being how you personally define the term new hardware. Hopefully that definition for you includes a slightly overclocked Gamecube CPU with just a little more video memory. With RE4 getting a whole butt ton of love on the Gamecube, it only made sense to port the game to what was essentially the same exact console with an IR-based motion control gimmick, and that's exactly what they did, creating what some would call the best playing version of this game to date. Now, I've made my disdain for this era of motion controls pretty clear in the past, but for those of you just tuning in, I never enjoyed the Wii's specific brand of inaccurate IR-based motion tracking. That being said, I have to admit its inclusion here really does make playing this game much more engaging. In fact, you could probably argue it nearly breaks RE4's difficulty, not having to wait for your aiming reticle to slowly move over to a target, and being able to pull off quick shots that just aren't possible using a traditional controller. It does make this really fucking fun. Plus, they added a quick knife shortcut activated by waggling the Wiimote, and even though I can't stand waggle mechanics, this is a godsend. It auto-targets the nearest knifeable object like a box or a downed enemy, which makes the old headshot, melee hit, knife them while they're down tactic much easier to pull off. The only downsides with this port being the rare occasion where you'll hit the aim button while your controller's pointed down, which means Leon's going to be pointing his gun at the ground in front of him, and the constant presence of this gray reticle. If you thought I hated the few moments where button prompts were on screen in RE4 for QTEs, trust me when I say this is way worse. Of course, I know most people don't share my obsession with immersion, so I assume the rest of you won't mind this quite so much. If you want, though, you could choose to forego motion controls altogether and use the Wii's classic remote or hell even a Gamecube controller for that added accuracy. And if you do go that route, the good news is, while you won't be able to make use of the motion shortcut for your knife, aiming and pulling your knife out with the controller on the Wii is noticeably faster than any other release of the game. The content not present in the original GameCube release of RE4 has been added here, so those of you super into Ada's Separate Ways campaign will be very happy. Like I said before, this campaign was never a selling point for me, but if you want that near GameCube experience but with the modern extras afforded to newer releases of the game, well, I guess it goes without saying, but this is the only place you're going to find it. However, some of you may have noticed I just said near GameCube experience, and there's a really good reason for that. It had been long rumored that the Wii had a less vibrant and more blurry component video output than the GameCube, but for a while the only people who could test this for themselves were the ones lucky enough or rich enough to get their hands on GameCube component cables. But now, thanks to products from Eon and Insurrection Industries, we can get quote-unquote cheap solutions that give us access to that coveted GC digital output. And yes, I can personally confirm that the GameCube version of RE4 is much sharper and more clear than what you'll find on the Wii. Personally, I would say the difference might be teeter-tottering on the borderline of being noticeable and not, but if you are looking for the absolute best picture with no compromises, the GameCube is still the reigning champ so far in this video. There is a little bonus included here in the Wii port though. I often forget that the Wii supports 16:9 widescreen, and yes, this version of the game does as well. Of course, they aren't drawing any extra graphics on the side of what would normally be 4:3, instead squishing the game's graphics so that they look right being stretched to widescreen. So I guess you could argue that this anamorphic approach isn't true 16:9, but it is widescreen nonetheless, and it's kinda cool to have it here. And the resulting picture is, well, it's mixed, honestly. I mean, sure, it's really nice having a full widescreen display filled with RE4, but since the RetroTink 5X only has accurate sampling for standard 480p, we're left with a generic 16:9 setting here, and the loss of sharpness and clarity is pretty noticeable. Personally, I'd suggest sticking with 4:3 for most Wii games anyways. I mean, none of these games are rendering out at an actual widescreen resolution, so you're just taking what used to be sharp pixels and distorting them once within the console itself, and then another time when your TV or scaler does the stretching. So while it is a novel addition, I'd say it's a little more fun just to experiment with and try out than it is to actually play a game that way. Other than that though, I'd say this is a pretty good choice when it comes time to play a little RE4. It may not have the graphical fidelity of the original GameCube release, but it has a bunch of additional content that may make it worth it for you weirdos that don't base all your decisions on pixel-perfect video output. Plus, even an old stuck-in-his-ways guy like myself can admit the motion aiming is actually really fun here. If we were ranking these releases, I would say this one might be close to neck and neck with the original. Personally, I would go with the GameCube version for its sharp video output, but I can certainly see why some of you might reach for that Wii mode instead.
¡Agárrenlo! Little rough, don't you think?
And coming up next we have, well, let's be honest, it's not the release a lot of you are probably hoping to see. Listen guys, I would absolutely love to get some footage of the Zeebo version actually being played, but as I recently found out, Zeebo emulation may as well be impossible at the moment thanks to how it authenticates games against its hardware, and its iOS counterpart can only be run on old legacy builds of iOS, which complicates things immensely. Plus, I think you could make a pretty strong argument for these iterations not exactly falling under the definition of a port, since none of them use original assets from any version of RE4. New fonts, new heads-up display, altered level layouts, and redrawn 3D graphics. I feel like that's at least enough to ensure I can sleep at night labeling this video a comprehensive look at every port of RE4 without including them. And let's be honest here, they weren't going to be very impressive in the first place. So instead of focusing on what can't be obtained, let's talk about the very first HD remaster of Resident Evil 4. Wanting a little more RE content on the new HD era of consoles, Capcom dragged both RE4 and Code Veronica into the present, which is actually kind of funny. The HD remaster of Code Veronica, while looking good in some circumstances, was actually a pretty bungled affair. There was ghosting and brightness issues across the board, along with a lot of other problems I outlined in a previous video, but oddly enough, the RE4 remaster came out relatively clean. Unlike all the creative changes made in Code Veronica, RE4 retains a pretty good level of parity with its original release, meaning what we have here is basically a nicer looking version of the Gamecube original. Today we'll be looking specifically at the PS3 release since I couldn't remember my Xbox Live login, but based on my research there's no significant difference between the two platforms. So what you can expect from both is a 720p 30 frame per second experience, which actually sort of surprised me. I had become so used to future remasters' 60 FPS treatment I had just sort of assumed it was the standard and not a new addition. But in Capcom's defense, the game was originally tuned for 30 FPS, so it still plays just as well as you remember, and hell, it's not like that era was filled with AAA releases achieving a better frame rate anyways. The Japanese were lucky enough to get this remaster in a physical form bundled with Code Veronica, while the rest of the world were doomed to a digital-only release model. And one thing I want to get out of the way ASAP is that this game actually looks a little better than what I'm able to show here. Since this video is being rendered out at 1440p to account for my RetroTing 5X recordings, I'm gonna have to stretch this 720p footage to twice its vertical resolution. Meaning we're definitely losing a bit of sharpness in the process of making this video watchable because I doubt very much anyone wants to look at this for an extended period of time. So take my word for it, this game looks much better than what you're seeing here. And continuing from that point, I was actually surprised at how good it did look for a measly 720p. Sure, it may have more to do with RE4's great art design, but these assets running in HD already look close to big budget new releases for the time. Either way though, I'd say don't count these original remasters out just because they're 2 generations behind. Sure, 60 frames per second is always going to be preferable, but playing this game designed for 30 FPS at its intended frame rate and in HD is still a great experience. Like I mentioned before, RE4 has some amazing sound design, and following logic, that same sound being pushed out as a fully digital package is a joy to listen to. From what I hear, the 360 version actually supports 5.1 surround sound, but it seems to be very poor decoding, with some sound effects hard locked to specific speakers no matter what situation you're in. So I guess it's no real loss that we've only got stereo output here on the PS3. On a very small list of possible downsides, I will mention that I experienced some slowdown in this scene with the waterfall, but on the other side of that coin, that's less slowdown than can be found in the original. I don't know, maybe I'll let you guys decide whether or not that's a problem. In the realm of totally unprovable nonsense, it felt like it was a little harder to shoot dynamite out of the air after it had been thrown in this version of the game, but there's even odds that was just random chance. But honestly, who cares about all this trivial stuff? Because this is officially the first time anyone ever laid eyes on RE4 without a third of their screen being taken up by black bars. Yes, as crazy as it sounds, it took Capcom a good 5 releases of this game before they decided to populate the full vertical resolution of our TVs with video. Sadly, this doesn't do much to combat the claustrophobic field of view since a majority of this game's action takes place on the horizontal plane, but damn it, it's just nice seeing something at the top and bottom of my screen again. Since we're working with HD graphics now, redrawn 2D art like the HUD and fonts was gonna be a must, and while I typically prefer to see the original assets upscaled, this new stuff looks great. It does kind of clash with the less smooth looking 3D graphics around it, but I doubt there would have been very much that could have been done about that either way. Luckily, all of the in-game cutscenes are just that in this release instead of poor quality pre-renders, so that is a huge plus, and as you might expect, this remaster includes all of the extra content that used to be spread across several consoles. As far as HD remasters go, this was one hell of a great job if you ask me. In this industry, something as simple as taking a great-looking game and upscaling it can often prove to be too Herculean of a task, so it's great to see Capcom really putting their best foot forward here. With a perfect balance being struck between alterations and accuracy, not only is this great to see in general, but more precisely for the rest of the games on this list. I say that because this dinky little sub 1080p 60 digital storefront title would become the framework from which every subsequent release of RE4 would be made. So let's all thank our lucky stars it turned out as great as it did. And even though newer, more high-res and smoother playing versions of this game exist today, I'd still recommend reinstalling it on your dusty old 7th gen console. Maybe don't go out and spend a $20 on it for a first experience like I did, but there might be some value in taking a look at how well this HD remaster turned out and thinking about how badly it could have. I sort of doubt there's many who would be interested in hooking up an old PS3 or 360 to play an inferior port of a game available on nearly every console under the sun, but if you are one of those few, just know you've got a solid time ahead of you.
Hey, it's that dog.
A good 3 years after the 7th gen HD remasters of RE4, Capcom was looking to both apologize for RE4's first foray on PC and to make a little scratch off the newly invigorated PC gaming market. This Ultimate HD edition, surprisingly, actually lives up to its title. This release would continue the trend of onwards and upwards with a higher operating resolution and a jump up to 60 FPS. So like you would imagine, this leads to a much smoother experience, but it does come with one small caveat. It seems like certain gameplay elements were tied to the game's old frame rate, the most important of which being the QuickTime events. Which means in this version of the game, it's expecting double the amount of inputs for sections that want you to mash a button, and you have to be even faster with button combinations because they'll be on screen for less time than in previous releases. Now in any other situation this might count as a downside, but realistically they aren't unwinnable at 60 FPS, just a little more challenging. I think it's fair to say the original 30 frame per second versions of these things weren't exactly sitting on the elite end of human reaction time, so if anything be ready to mash a little faster and recognize button combos just a bit quicker. Oh, and I'd like to thank a few viewers who brought this up during a recent live stream because I had no idea why the QTEs were a little more challenging than I remembered until they slapped some knowledge upside my head. Okay, so frame rate aside, what else under the hood's been messed around with? Well, the game runs at a massive amount of resolutions now, but most importantly, it is no longer limited to 720p. So we're getting a much higher res, more detailed picture this time around, but that leads to a bit of an issue for some. What you're looking at here are the same exact assets present in the original Resident Evil 4, just intelligently upscaled, and as you go higher and higher in resolution, it becomes pretty clear that the old 2D textures were just too low res to make a proper jump into true HD. The original Gamecube release of RE4 famously didn't use MIP maps, so not only were textures woefully undersized for such a high operating resolution, but the seams, for lack of a better word, were always visible when textures would overlap. To combat this, the Ultimate HD version includes a toggle for what they call HD textures, but don't get too excited, this option can be a little deceiving. Capcom didn't exactly go through and redraw every low-res texture in the game, but by my estimation, the only thing they really cleaned up were the textures used for items and a few other small additions like altering the look of Leon's clothes, which by the way only works on his default costume and not the ones you can unlock by beating the game. And you'll notice I said alter, not improve, because I really can't see much of an improvement here. Sure, it's different, but I doubt very much anyone would notice if you unchecked the HD textures option mid-game while they were playing. From what I can see, they didn't even touch the environmental textures aside from upping their contrast, which in their defense does give the illusion of more defined edges, but trust me, it is just that, an illusion. For as long as this version of the game has existed, people have been complaining about its low-res textures, and I'm about to blow your minds by saying, yeah, I never really cared too much. I know, I'm the guy who's supposed to be obsessed with video stuff, but really these textures are not the experience killer people make them out to be. Rewind Mike. And sure, yes, they are noticeably low res, but the entire game has this sort of smooth look to it thanks to the upscaling, and I'd say the textures sort of add to that. Either way, they're not the most offensive graphical features I've ever seen in this kind of an HD remaster, so maybe don't let the internet tell you how bad they are. Here's a good rule of thumb to go by. If you never notice them until I mention something, congrats, they don't really matter. Although we definitely will be looking at a little fan-made fix for that issue later on.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
Moving on to actual gameplay, this release of RE4 stays in line with previous ones, which means it includes all the extra content from the other ports, and unlike the original PC release, mouse and keyboard controls. And surprising no one, using a mouse can lead to much more accurate shooting, but I will say this, I typically reach for a USB controller when playing this version 9 times out of 10, which is very crazy for me since I'm never one to forgo mouse look on a third-person game. I think the issue comes not so much from the shooting, but the movement. Using a keyboard, you'll be hitting ASWD to move around, but your hand will still be on the mouse. And if you happen to move that mouse while running around, which trust me you will do, it'll just rotate the camera, which only moves your view, it doesn't change your orientation. So it's not exactly impossible to get used to, just a little annoying to deal with. On the negative side of things, it is much easier to perform QTEs when the on-screen display includes button size and color, which doesn't exactly work when nearly every key on a keyboard is basically uniform. It may be a lot easier to mash a mechanical keyboard switch than a traditional controller button, but I can instinctively and thoughtlessly reach for a button displayed on screen while I still have to think about which keyboard key the game's asking me to hit. This may not be much of an issue for some of you, but for me, playing with a mouse and keyboard required a little bit too much of a learning curve, or at least one I wasn't keen on climbing. On the plus side though, 60 FPS gameplay is awesome. The game feels expectedly snappy and responsive at a smoother frame rate, and this is one inclusion I can say is 100% an improvement. Sadly, that wasn't so much the case in the early days of its release. From what I've heard, this version had a lot of stability issues on launch and would routinely dip below 60 frames per second. And if there's one big downside with jumping the frame rate up like that, it's that you'll really be able to tell when it deviates even 3 FPS from max. On the plus side though, all of these issues have been fixed by the time I got my hands on it, so I can't really say how bad it was, but I can tell you it's good now. Nowadays, I'd say this is the go-to port if you're looking for not only a remaster, but a versatile one. Sure, 1080p is all well and good, but being able to scale up to 1440p or 4K is always going to be a little more appealing. And you know, there's also that whole 60 FPS thing. But thanks to people much smarter and more dedicated than I, you have another option when getting in a game of RE4 on PC. Like I mentioned before, people tend to get pretty upset with RE4's low-resolution textures in this port, and while I don't mind them at all myself, it looks like someone was bothered enough to finally go in and fix Capcom's work for them. The Resident Evil 4 HD Project is a pretty big fan-made patch that includes much higher resolution assets than the base game. Nearly every single texture in the game has been updated to look much sharper and more defined with this mod, and if you don't immediately get how amazing that is, keep in mind, for a lot of cases, these aren't exactly upscales of the original assets. A lot of these textures have been redrawn from scratch, either being hand-drawn or composites of very high-resolution pictures. In doing that work, obviously, things aren't going to look precisely like the originals, so there is an argument for accuracy to be made, but seeing the game's original textures next to the modified ones will likely get rid of any reservations you might have on that front. Sadly, the game still can't take advantage of MIP maps, so you're still going to see a hard line where textures intersect, but at least those hard lines will now be on something that looks really good. Items also get to benefit from the HD treatment, and while I never really noticed how low-res they looked in the vanilla release, seeing them now really drives that point home. Applying this patch is relatively easy, something not exactly common in the world of PC game modding, so that is a plus. The only real downside being that it is a whopping 30 gig download. After the patch has been applied, the results are going to be obvious, and while it is a great improvement, I couldn't help but notice something. While I was playing with the HD texture pack, I kept noticing myself looking at the background textures while I'm playing. In vanilla RE4, I never really noticed them during gameplay, so my eye was always on the action straight ahead. While playing this modded version, I just can't keep my eyes off all the little details in the background, and I can't really tell what's at fault here. On one end, I think there's a chance these new textures are so sharp and crispy looking that they sort of naturally draw the eye towards them and away from Leon or the action. Kinda like they form a bit of a natural contrast between the high-res 2D stuff and the noticeably lower-res 3D assets. Of course, it is also totally possible that this only affects me and only exists because I know I applied the patch and am purposefully looking to see what's different. If you're familiar with game modding on PC, you'll know it's not always a 100% stable affair, and while I was able to find a glitch where the chandelier was vibrating during the cutscene introducing Salazar, I can't really be sure if this was just a random occurrence in the base game or if it was being caused by the mod itself. Either way, there's no risk in heading over to the RE4 HD Project's website and trying it out for yourself. Personally, I wouldn't call this a necessary addition for anyone playing this release, but it's awesome to look at, and it's good seeing people who aren't happy with the game going in and making the changes they would have liked to have seen in the original release. According to the website, this project hasn't been updated since about 2018, which is a real damn shame because this guy's saying he's working on remastering the pre-rendered cutscenes from Ada's Separate Ways campaign, but needs a coder to insert them into the game. So if you are somehow smart enough to code but also dumb enough to watch my videos, maybe get in contact with this guy so we can finally see this thing completed.
Over here, stranger.
Okay, so this one comes down to the wire, but RE4 on PC is probably my favorite of the ports so far. Don't get me wrong, I love the look of the original on real hardware. In fact, I probably prefer it, and the first HD remasters on PS3 and 360 were certainly impressive, but the combination of support for much higher resolutions and a doubling of the frame rate is just too good to ignore. Other ports going forward would use this as a base, which is great, but I just don't think you can do much better than this. So if you have a computer made after the year 2000, you've got no real reason not to hop on Steam and give it a whirl. It's not the last port we'll cover today, but it very well may be the best. After successfully improving on their work with the first HD remaster, Capcom decided to keep that ball rolling with ports to the PS4 and Xbox One. These would use this Ultimate HD release as a base, and that means including every feature found therein. As far as video output is concerned, we're looking at a max 1080p affair here, luckily carrying over the 60 frame per second output of the last version, and it looks and plays about like what you would expect. The game honestly looks great at 1080p, and since it doesn't go any higher than that, the issue some people have with lower res textures won't seem quite so obvious when sitting pretty far back on a couch. We're looking at the PS4 side of things here because that's the console I own, but from what I hear, the experience is just about the same, if not almost imperceptibly better on the Xbox One. Now, I would love to test that for myself, but YouTube hasn't got me to that disposable income level of wealth yet. During my time with the PS4 port, I didn't notice any frame rate dips, which is expected on such powerful hardware, but there was one black cloud hanging over the experience. The default control setup was really weird and didn't make any sense at all to me. For some reason, it has you using R2 to fire your weapon when every game so far has used the old aim with R1 and fire with the action button approach. And yes, I was able to change it to something a little more familiar, but I kind of wonder why they'd go in and make the default configuration for this port be so wildly different from the original release. I mean, you gotta figure people playing this version would be looking to play it the same way they did the original, but hell, for all I know, this might be some sort of really efficient speedrunner approved control setup. You guys tell me. And if you can't tell by me complaining about having to go into the options and change my controls, there's not much to say about this release that I haven't already said. This is just a rock-solid version of RE4 that offers all of the benefits of the Steam version, only lacking the ability to mod its textures and the option for higher resolutions. If you don't have a PC of any kind, this would definitely be your best bet. After spending a pretty good amount of time with it, I didn't find any slowdown or other porting flaws, so for those of you only looking for a console experience, this will basically be the most perfect way you can play the game. A compliment I can most definitely not give to the next port.
I'm Ingrid Hunnigan. I'll be your support on this mission.
Loud and clear. Somehow I thought you'd be a little older.
Listen, if it exists as a platform, as a general rule of thumb, Capcom will at some point try to put RE4 on it, and when the Nintendo Switch blew up like a bat out of hell, seeing this title appear in its library was inevitable. And plus, you guys know how it goes. A developer makes a game, and almost the whole of Twitter asks the cursed three-word question literally no one wants to hear: Switch port when? RE4 showed up on the platform nearly 4 years ago and uses the previous HD release as its base. It offers all of the trappings you would expect by this point, with the only deviation coming in the form of its operating resolution. When docked, the Switch can't seem to hit a full 1080p, instead opting for 900p, and when in handheld you can expect a sub 720 600p. Now, realistically, only a few of us are so hard to please that we'd mourn the loss of 180 pixels off the vertical resolution, but it's this combined with the next point that makes this port so sad. Even at its diminished resolution, RE4 on the Switch has a very hard time maintaining a full 60 frames per second. Now, don't get me wrong, if I'm looking down a large crowd of Plagas-infected villagers in a detailed backdrop, sure, I'd be fine with a little bit of slowdown. I mean, yeah, you could argue that's a little ridiculous for a modern platform running a 16-year-old game, but hey, this is the Switch we're talking about. The culmination of Nintendo's Wii-era obsession with staying a good 2 generations behind the industry. Now, like I said before, a little slowdown isn't the end of the world, but I'm dropping a significant amount of frames just running up the stairs in the first house in the game, and these are not what I would call the most detail-rich stairs in gaming. But that's kind of the odd part. When a bunch of enemies are on screen, you'd expect a similar result, but the amount of 3D models in front of you doesn't seem to affect it much. Here on this bridge, there are 3 or 4 villagers in front of me, but things stay smooth. It's only after they've despawned that I notice significant slowdown, so it's gotta be the environment that seems to be bringing this release to its knees. To be fair though, maybe I'm the type of guy who puts more of an importance on this stuff than others, but that's why I've grown so tired of the port it to the Switch meme. Even though every single port we get on the console ends up being a sub-HD, sub-30 frame per second mess, we keep asking for more as if we haven't already been burned a million times in the past. Of course, there is the portable component to consider, but personally, I'm not willing to take a hit in smooth gameplay just to allow for a little RE4 on a long car ride. If I were you and I was looking for a version of this game that's both HD and plays well, this would certainly not be my first stop, but if we are being honest, a little stutter here or there isn't the worst issue in the world. You personally may not mind it at all, and there very well may be some of you who never even noticed it in the first place. However, if we are comparing these ports and ranking them by how well they perform, the Switch version sort of ends up near the bottom of the list. Sorry guys.
Well, I see that the president's equipped his daughter with ballistics too.
With that, we have finally reached the end of this incredibly long list. There's no denying RE4 is one of the most ported games in existence, and to be fair, it's important enough to the industry overall to justify that title. There are 7 total viable options in front of someone looking to play Resident Evil 4 nowadays, and of them I would say only the original PC release counts as a don't touch this port with a 10-foot pole kind of scenario. From the original Gamecube release to the most recent iteration on the Switch, I would say each one is perfectly playable in its own way. Personally, I've grown a newfound respect for the original Gamecube version of the game, and when it comes time for a new playthrough, that'll probably be the one I reach for. In the last few years, I've developed an appreciation for the Gamecube's interesting looking video output, and now when I see that vertical dithering pattern, I just can't help but love it. I used to just flat out hate the PS2 port, but after seeing it in 480p for the first time, while it is still noticeably less defined than the original, I was still relatively impressed. But if I had to choose a modern method for getting a little RE4 in, it would definitely be the current Steam port. Not only do we get the same great gameplay, but the added bonus of more customization, higher res graphics, and 60 FPS gameplay. If you don't have a PC, the PS4 and Xbox One ports will deliver roughly the same experience, and if you want to take a Leon on the go with you, minus some less than reliable performance, the Switch version isn't a bad direction either. I know that's a bit of a cop-out, but honestly, outside the original PC hack job, each version of RE4 is perfectly playable nowadays. While you can definitely find pros and cons between them, they're so minute it's almost not worth mentioning. Which means there's some good news here. If you own any game console developed just a little bit after the Y2K scare, you are in possession of a great way to play Resident Evil 4, and I think that's fitting. This was an incredibly important game, not only to the RE franchise, but to video games as a whole. And when something reaches this level of admiration, bad port jobs and low-effort HD remasters aren't too far behind. We should honestly thank our lucky stars Capcom didn't drop the ball with this one and delivered us a close to perfect experience with every release of this game. So go ahead and grab whatever copy of RE4 is closest to you or easiest to get your hands on, because you will without a doubt get a near flawless result with any of them. Well guys, I appreciate you sitting through this long as hell deep dive with me, and here's hoping this isn't the last time we talk about RE4 on this little project. But until we get our hands on a remake or the VR version, I hope to see all of you guys again right here on the Resident Evil Retrospective. Hello my lovelies, I very much appreciate you spending some of your day with me here. If you like in-depth coverage of ports like this, why not give my other videos in the series a look, and if you really enjoy what I do here, maybe think about supporting these efforts over on Patreon. But if that's not in your wheelhouse, hey, a little like and subscribe never hurt anyone, right? Well, you guys stay cool, and I will see all of you again very soon.